Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jack Batten, and I'm a junior serving as Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. program here at Yale. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this morning's panel on federal reforms of higher education. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We've hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley student fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to get involved on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression, as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of our fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now for our guests. Akhil Reed Amar is Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law in both Yale College and Yale Law School. After graduating from Yale College in 1980 and from Yale Law in 1984, and clerking for Judge, later Justice Stephen Breyer, Amar joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at the age of 26. He is Yale's only living professor to have won the university's unofficial Triple Crown: the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. Professor Amar's work has won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society, and he has been cited by Supreme Court justices across the political spectrum in more than 50 cases. He regularly testifies before Congress at the invitation of both parties. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has written widely for popular publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time, and the Atlantic. Along with Andy Lipka, he co-hosts a popular weekly podcast, America's Constitution. Michael Strambler directs child well-being and education research at the Consultation Center at Yale, where he also serves as senior evaluation consultant for Yale Eval. Professor Strambler received his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California at Berkeley and conducted his predoctoral fellowship at the Institute for Juvenile Research at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Upon completing this fellowship, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Rush Neurobehavioral Center. Strambler completed his postdoctoral training at the Consultation Center at Yale School of Medicine. Much of Dr. Strambler's research addresses the sociopolitics of health and education, aiming to understand how sociopolitical factors shape the delivery of healthcare and education, and how these dynamics can both benefit and hinder positive outcomes for patients and students. Stanley Kurtz is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center on a wide range of issues from K-12 and higher education reform to the challenges of democratization abroad to urban-suburban policies to the shaping of the American left's agenda. Dr. Kurtz is a key contributor to American political debates. He has written on these and other issues for various journals, particularly National Review Online, where he is a contributing editor. Dr. Kurtz received his undergraduate degree from Haverford College and his PhD in social anthropology from Harvard University. He later taught at Harvard, winning several awards for his work in a Great Books program. He was also Dewey Prize Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Chicago. Dr. Kurtz's latest book, The Lost History of Western Civilization, authors both a critique of deconstructionist history and a new way of looking at America's cultural conflicts. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So thank you all so much for joining us today. So I'm sure everyone here is familiar with many of the Trump administration's recent actions taken against elite colleges and universities, from threatening to tax their endowments, to revoking funding, to most recently attempting to bar international students from studying at Harvard. And we'll get to a discussion of these policies, but I'd like to start a little closer to home. How has higher ed been doing on free speech, on handling protests, and on dealing with anti-Semitism? What grade would you give American universities, and how deep does the problem go? Is this something that can be cured with a scalpel kind of approach, or does it need a sledgehammer? Dr. Kurtz, I wonder if you could begin us.
Well, higher education is never going to reform without a push from the outside. And that's because I think the system has backfired. If you take the traditional conception of academic freedom and you're hiring, you go out and you hire a professor strictly based on expertise, nothing to do with politics. Or alternatively, in a field like, say, political philosophy, you make a concerted effort to hire the very best spokesman you can find for competing points of view. But what's happened in reality is that faculty members on the left have worked very hard to reproduce themselves. And as a result, there are very few conservatives left on the faculty. And what that yields is an unbreakable intellectual monopoly that is actually protected by the system of tenure. And this is what gives rise to the intolerant campus orthodoxy that's behind the problems you mentioned, attacks on free speech and disruptive protests, anti-Semitism, et cetera. So when you've got a system whose core problem is grounded in an unbreakable intellectual monopoly among the tenured faculty, there is no way you're going to get reform strictly from the inside. You're going to have to invoke pressure from the outside. In other words, you're going to have to use a sledgehammer.
One of you gentlemen care to follow up?
Yes. So I agree with Stanley about the monoculture that's being formed on many universities across the country. I think that's a major problem. I think maybe where we disagree is how the push needs to come from the outside. I agree that a push does need to come from the outside. If we're thinking about a sledgehammer as something that is destroying a system or an institution, I don't think the sledgehammer is the appropriate approach to use. I'm more in favor of the scalpel approach. Just thinking about all the issues on university campuses and how the public views universities, we're clearly in what I would think of as a crisis. Public confidence in universities is at an all-time low. I think the number is 36% of the public have confidence, a lot or quite a bit of confidence in universities. That's a major problem. Most of that, a lot of that comes from conservatives, but not all of it, not all of it. So that's a major problem. The deplatforming on campuses is a major problem. At FIRE, the organization FIRE tracks deplatforming, and over the past several years, that number has been increasing. I don't know if it's at an all-time high, like confidence in universities is at an all-time low, but it's been substantially increasing over time. That's a major problem. All of that leads to a form of censorship and a kind of self-censorship that's been occurring. If we believe that universities are to be centers of academic freedom and free speech, we should be pushing back against both forms of censorship, the traditional form of censorship and self-censorship. However, not all universities suffer in the same way from this monoculture and to the same degree. And to the degree that some universities do suffer from it, it's not uniform across all disciplines. I think it's primarily concentrated in humanities and social sciences, and not even across all social sciences. For example, I think economics is not as effective as some of the other social sciences. So I think it's also important not to exaggerate the problem. It's a real problem that needs to be addressed. But I think we need to be careful about putting that into perspective. Universities are still making extremely valuable contributions to society, and I think we need to I think we need to remember that important fact. And so I would be more in favor of a scalpel than a sledgehammer.
Dr. Amar, any thoughts?
So anyone who knows me knows I'm not shy about expressing views, and that I often have very strong views, but I tend to have very strong views on things where I consider myself quite an expert. I'm not an expert on higher education across the board. So when we get to talking about Yale, I can tell you a lot about Yale. I can actually tell you about lots of other places where I regularly visit or have regularly visited. Those include Columbia, Harvard, Penn, and other places. And when we talk about government policy, I have some thoughts as a political scientist and as a constitutional scholar on some of the things that are being proposed, some of which I think are quite bad and perhaps unconstitutional in various ways. But on higher education across the board, I'm not going to weigh in so much because I haven't studied it. And part of, I think, the claims of authority that some academics try to make are warranted if and only if they're backed by expertise and scholarship. And on higher education across the board, I can't claim that. I'll say one thing, and maybe we'll come back to it. So I'll reserve most of my comments, I hope, for other elements of our discussion. Since my friend mentioned FIRE, I can report to you that one of the directors of FIRE, I think maybe even one of the founders, the great Keith Whittington, has recently joined the Yale Law School faculty. He also has an appointment in political science. I have an appointment in both, and I'm very glad that he's here. I can't tell you about all the roles that other people may have played because of confidentiality, but I can out myself and saying that I pushed very hard for this and welcomed him. I suspect we're going to be writing briefs together on various things. On other issues, we may be on opposite sides, so be it. We've already had events at Yale Law School, some that I've run, that have involved Keith very prominently. So since this is a Yale reunion, I think I get to say tell you at least that. And it's a twofer because we nabbed him from Princeton.
Thank you, everyone. I wonder if you could all comment on potential positives and negatives of the Trump administration's approach toward, higher education in general and Yale in particular. What are some potential positives, and what are some ways that our institutions could be harmed or collateral damage could be created?
Well, on the positives, I think we've already seen some positive effects from Trump administration policies. We've had encampments and disruptive demonstrations at Columbia, Swarthmore, University of Washington, and of course Yale. And in every case, they've been shut down far more rapidly and with far more serious disciplinary consequences than what we would have seen last year. Now, for me, the big issue is campus intellectual diversity. So I'm going to put in a plug for my proposal. I've publicly made a proposal for a way in which Harvard and the administration might come to an out-of-court settlement on their differences on intellectual diversity, and it could potentially serve as a model for other schools. And very briefly, what it involves is first requiring of all undergraduates a one-year course in Western civilization, and as well a one-semester course in American history and civics. And then you establish an independent academic unit to be put in charge of teaching those courses. And then you go out and hire a bunch of educational traditionalists to teach those courses. And what I mean by traditionalists is the kind of professor who has expertise in and commitment to the classic great books approach. Now, that kind of professor is going to skew conservative, but won't be exclusively conservative. In Yale terms, this would be like a major expansion in the size and function and role of directed studies. So this would be a way of approaching campus intellectual diversity that would not put a school into de facto federal receivership as in the infamous Harvard demand letter, and also would not impose an ideological litmus test. Now, should I go into the bad?
Please,
or let
yeah.
everyone else? All right.
Sure.
Well, I'll comment on three big complaint areas about the administration's policies. First, the possibility of politicizing nonprofit status, then the disruption to medical and scientific research, and then the procedural shortcuts the administration has been taking, particularly on withdrawing funding under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Yes, I do think there's legitimate reason to worry about politicizing nonprofit status. The Bob Jones case is an important precedent. I think it's problematic in various ways, and all things considered, I would rather approach the issue of nonprofit status legislatively. Congress might have some tweaks it wants to make to the conditions for universities receiving nonprofit status, but that would be an across-the-board law rather than administrative fiat, and I'd be more comfortable with that. On disruption to research, I think while it's certainly unfortunate, it's a necessary concomitant of the very important efforts that the administration is making to reform higher education. Now, I hope it will be temporary, because I suspect that despite all of the troubles we're having right now, there may be an out-of-court settlement, and not that far in the future, with Harvard and formally or informally other universities. But if that doesn't happen, then I think we're going to see federal money and also maybe professors moving in the direction of institutions that are currently considered second tier. And as far as the procedural shortcuts, I think that if there is no out-of-court settlement of the Harvard controversy, the administration is going to lose. It's going to lose the first Harvard case and probably the Harvard case that was filed the other day. But I still think the universities are going to lose in the end. Short term, the administration is taking shortcuts. Over the long term, if Trump and maybe a future J.D. Vance are president, the universities are going to lose, I think, a protracted struggle with the federal government because it has too many powerful levers. And over time, I think you're going to see them not taking those procedural shortcuts. So from my perspective, which is kind of biased, I think the universities ought to settle or reform themselves preemptively to avoid future problems.
On balance, I think that the approach of the administration is a net negative. I think that they're doing more unnecessary harm to universities than potentially benefiting universities. But, I try to be, as I think everyone should be, open to the possibilities of understanding the potential benefits. And I think some of the positives of these policies could be cracking down on the most egregious forms of discrimination, cracking down on anti-Semitism, for example, the deplatforming I mentioned earlier, and acts of violence that sometimes occur during protests. So those are some of the things that I think the administration has been very aggressive towards addressing. They're entirely unacceptable on university campuses. And so to the extent that we're curbing those kinds of behaviors, I think that's a good thing. So I think those are some of the potential benefits and positives. I think a lot of that is outweighed by many of the negatives. So think about all the things that have been attempted or actually been enacted over the past several months. The NIH indirect cost, cutting that to 15%. Yale's rate was 67.5. And one could ask whether 67.5 is too high. Maybe, I don't know. But I know it's not 15, and that's a dramatic effect. That has a dramatic effect on research and being able to do research, especially in the sciences and in the medical school where I'm based. Canceling of federal contracts and grants based on sometimes allegedly AI searches for terms that suggest that some of this work is DEI oriented, or that these grants are just wasteful, is highly problematic for supporting research in universities. The endowment tax, increasing that, the proposal to increase that, and that's recently been passed in the House from 1.4% to 21%, the increasing by 15 times what it currently is going to harm universities if that is passed in, I think, extreme ways. The president has commented on that. The demands of universities, some of which Stanley made of, for example, putting them into receivership. All of these things are diminishing the infrastructure for some of the best and brightest within the country, I'd argue in the world, to make important contributions to our society. So yes, there are some positives that can come out of these policies, but on balance, I think they're unnecessarily intense and will ultimately be damaging to universities that provide major contributions to improving our society.
So let's just go through some of them. I'm quite opposed to most of what the administration has done and is doing. So for grants that are already made, there's maybe no entitlement to government money, but once you make a contract is a contract, and there are rules for cutting it off retroactively, and those rules haven't been followed, and that's just blatantly illegal, and you don't need to be the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale University to figure that one out. Okay, you just have to actually care about law, which Pam Bondi doesn't and Donald Trump doesn't. So that's clear. And anyone who believes in the things that William Buckley stood for in his life, including private property and limited government and the rule of law, should be deeply concerned by that. Now, going forward, should we have this robust subsidy of scientific research in major universities? Now, again, I'm not so much an expert on that, but I am a political scientist, and if you don't have and this partnership between great nonprofits and the government actually worked pretty well over the last 100 years, giving us NASA and all sorts of stuff and amazing medical innovation. My brother is a Yale-trained neurosurgeon. My wife is a professor in the med school. My brother is a professor at another med school at a major research university. And so I think we're the envy of the world in that when it comes to new drugs and new treatments and the physical sciences and the biological sciences. And if you don't do it in partnership with nonprofits, you're going to have a bigger government maybe doing that. And I think it's maybe better to have a public-private partnership rather than a big stinky socialist scheme. That's so there's that. Now, speaking about socialism, because my friend Stanley wrote a book saying the Obama administration was socialist. Well, wow. It's not just that it's a 15-fold increase, it's a 21% per annum tax on the wealth of private universities. So you do that for 5 years and then there's nothing left. I know it's
income. Not the wealth, the income.
No, it's the endowment. That's wealth, that's not income. Okay, I actually am a tax expert. I've written a lot on tax. I filed briefs in the United States Supreme Court on tax. This is not income. Now, my friend Steve Calabrese, founder of the Federalist Society, national co-chair, has actually filed briefs in the Supreme Court saying wealth taxes are unconstitutional. I'm not so sure that's true. And you could read that book over there that talks about Alexander Hamilton and what a direct tax actually is under the Constitution. But when you have a 21% tax on the endowment, not the income generated by the endowment, but the endowment itself, and you do that for several years, oh my God. Okay, and you talk about socialism. Oh, wow. And this targets only a few institutions, many of whom that have been opposed to the government as a practical matter for reasons that you've already heard. This starts to look perilously close to a bill of attainder, which is unconstitutional, actually, under Article 1, Section 10, to single out basically a handful, a tiny handful, maybe 20 or 30. It's only a few big universities with huge endowments. And these endowments were created by people like us, alums, who give often our post-tax dollars, and sometimes we don't even get tax deductions for that because we don't all itemize. So we take our post-tax dollars and we give it to, our alma mater, which we actually believe in, and then they take it away. Wow. And they take it away from people who are opposed to the government. That looks way more like Fidel Castro and than anything that Obama, was claimed to have done. And I'm no fan of AOC or Bernie Sanders, just so you understand where I'm coming from. I'm not, in the socialist wing of the Democratic Party, though I am a member of the Democratic Party. Okay, so there's that. Okay, now these this thought that there should be a mandate cutting off the flow of foreign students. This seems to me deeply problematic. A huge part of America's soft power is we have the best and the brightest from all around the world. And this is very personal to me because I exist because of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where I'm born, because actually my parents are international students born who meet in the University of Michigan. And that's true of Barack Obama. He doesn't exist but for the University of Hawaii, where his parents meet. This has been a great source of American soft power in the world, that we draw the best and the brightest, and now if we're repelling them, oh my gosh, and we're doing so quasi, almost retroactively, because existing students at Harvard today don't know actually if they can stay at Harvard, and that's 27% of the students at Harvard, so that worries me. Now, I think actually universities have to report and tell the government what their foreign students are doing, and that's perfectly valid. And I don't know, what Harvard has done or hasn't done. I do know they discriminated against Asian Americans and were adjudicated to have done so by the United States Supreme Court in the Students for Fair Admission case. So Harvard may have done all sorts of bad things. Boo Harvard. This is a Yale reunion after all. But so they have to comply with the rules, and they have to actually report on international students. But the administration, to my mind, has not been particularly punctilious about following law, and I'm worried that they're just doing stuff because they don't like Harvard, not because Harvard isn't properly reporting information. So those, I think, are as for the idea of mandating an expanded DS or an expanded civics program, well, there are rules in order to get accreditation, but I'd be opposed to actually a big, stinky, one-size-fits-all government mandate, which looks a lot like socialism to me. I say that as someone who loves DS at Yale. I think it's one of the jewels of the crown of Yale College. And I'm wearing a Yale for Life tie, which is connected actually in certain ways. It grows out of the DS, the Directed Studies program. And I teach a course basically on American civics. I've taught more Yale College undergraduates over the last 25 years than I think anyone except maybe Laurie Santos. So I love this. I don't love government mandating this. I have to make a case for myself. At the beginning, we used to have shopping period. We got rid of it. That was horrible, and complained to the administrators about that. But I need to make a case for why you should take this course, why it's more important than some of these other ones in a free market way with students. So I don't love big, stinky, one-size-fits-all government mandates, even though I very much believe in civilization, even Western civilization, even the canon, American history. Gandhi was once asked what he thought of Western civilization. He paused and he said, "I think it would be a good idea."
Well, thank you very much.
Can I just ask a quick
please.
question? But would you favor the proposal as something voluntary that Yale would do on its own because it's the right thing to do?
Yes. And I've always advocated this, and I'd rather that alums, tell administrators that, oh, we're with Amar on this, rather than the government do this. Absolutely.
Right. Let me say one other thing.
And by the way, I, as a parent, 2 of our kids are, at Yale, and I did a lot of sort of shopping around as a consumer when I took all the kids to all the places. I teach 1 day a week in the spring at Columbia. I quite like the Columbia kind of core curriculum idea. I think it's actually a pretty impressive thing.
Right.
You might know, from your point of view, but it seems to me, I teach in the law school, that's great.
Right. Let me note that, well, first of all, I was putting this forward as a negotiated settlement, so it would not be entirely a government.
Negotiated settlement, gun-to-head.
But let
Geez,
me,
a nice school you have here. It'd be a shame if
Right.
something happened to it.
Right. But let me
the Vito Corleone school of
but
negotiation.
let me speak to that because
I should say. Let me just. I'm sorry. I know
Yes.
because Trump comes from. Well, why don't you go on? And I'll tell you where the school of law that he kind of is associated with.
Let me just say that
which is mob law.
Let me invoke authority here. I have the American Association of University Professors on my side. Granted, it's from 110 years ago. But the American Association of University Professors began with his very famous statement in 1915, defining academic freedom. And it's very much worth reading, especially the end of the statement, because that's the part that talks about the responsibility that the academy has under academic freedom. And what they say there, and I have to paraphrase, I don't have an exact quote, but they basically say, if we abuse the freedom that meaning academic freedom, that we're asking you for in the name of scientific impartiality by creating an atmosphere of partisanship, then outsiders who don't know anything about academia are going to come in and set it right, whether we like it or not. And they were exactly right, and that's exactly what has happened. So, yeah, Trump is going to be clumsy. He's going to put on pressure, but the academy has richly earned it, and it was all predicted 110 years ago. And by the way, this original statement on academic freedom has been effectively repudiated by the modern American Academy of Professors in a 2007 statement called Freedom in the Classroom, I think, which was co-authored by a Yale law school professor. They basically abandoned all of the responsibility and the strictures. At the University of California, they used to have regulations saying you shouldn't have indoctrination in classes. Those have now been eliminated. It happened after Palestinian teaching assistant said that he didn't want any conservatives in his class. And people started citing this old thing against indoctrination that came out of the original AAUP statement. And so the faculty just eliminated the strictures against indoctrination. So yeah, it's clumsy. It's the wrong way to go to have the federal government intervene. But what do you expect after what's happened?
Well, you made 2 points. One is about leftist bias. I understand that, but a mandate for, and to repeat, I love DS. I teach, I've taught a course on American constitutional law every year for the last 24 years here at Yale, and I do it for free because the law school pays my salary, but I went to Yale College and I love the place. Changed my life. But I don't think not teaching that would be a violation of academic freedom. You know, a leftist bias might be a violation of academic freedom, rightly understood. We should teach DS not because and Western civilization and American constitutional law, not because academic freedom so requires, but just because it's a smart thing to do if we're training, America's leaders and the world's leaders.
Well, it wouldn't be a violation of academic freedom, but that's just because academic freedom requires certain areas of discretion and responsibility from the faculty. This is what was outlined at the end. It basically says, in order to have our freedom, we can't let you make rules to prevent us from being biased, but it's our responsibility. And if we don't do it right, then everything's going to get messed up because outsiders are going to come in. So the whole system depends on responsible exercise of certain principles of restraint, and they have not been exercised. So what do you expect?
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in, I think that the universities are in desperate need of reform. I agree with that 100%, and I also agree that they need outside pressure to do that. Some of that outside pressure was already underway prior to Trump. And so I was a part of a faculty group here at Yale that was urging Yale to adopt a statement of institutional neutrality. Yale did that. It's not called institutional neutrality, it's called the institutional voice, but it's essentially adopting a position that the universities should not speak on issues unless they're directly relevant to the functioning of the university or to the university's core mission. So all of that happened prior to Trump being elected.
And credit where it's due, the great Nicholas Christakis deserves your...
Yes, many people. Nicholas Christakis.
And many other people. I was involved in that too, but Nicholas Christakis preeminently.
Yes, Nicholas Christakis, Julia Adams, Kate Stith, number of people.
The great Kate Stith.
Deserve a great deal of credit for leading that. And many other universities also had adopted those statements. I don't remember the number offhand. So I think that's important also to acknowledge that, yes, that pressure, I think a lot of it came from the congressional hearing. That triggered outrage from many and a lot of pressure from the outside on universities. So I think that's important to acknowledge that some of this was underway. Universities were making changes. They were making new proposals as well. They were beginning to change in the ways that the public was demanding of them.
And on the congressional hearings, there is a difference between some of these big sledgehammer government mandates, some of which are unconstitutional and others are just very bad ideas, socialistic. There's a difference between that and congressional oversight, which actually is a disinfectant, bringing attention, public attention to things, and everyone can benefit from oversight.
Yeah, I think that marks an excellent place to move into our Q&A period. Isabel will be around with a microphone. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, and when you get the microphone, just stand up and briefly introduce yourself. And you can direct your question to one of our panelists in particular or to a group of them.
Terrific panel. A couple observations. If an industry or a group doesn't self-regulate, you invite problems. I'm in finance. I remember screaming at heads of Wall Street banks. I've been in the industry for 40-odd years. Say, if you don't self-regulate, the government's going to come after you. This is pre-GFC, and they didn't. The fact that nobody went to jail after that's another story. But if you don't self-regulate, you're going to invite outsiders to regulate. I agree that Yale has done a better job than some other institutions. This policy, whether you call it neutrality, whatever the name of it is. However, that's really been more the exception than the rule. And Yale is not really in the forefront of what the real problem is. We're concerned about Yale because we're here. But other leading institutions have not done similarly. And if we stipulate that, yes, the sledgehammer is not the right approach, I don't think it is the right approach. But if we also can stipulate and agree that universities have done and continue to do a lot of things they shouldn't be doing, even Harvard, by its own admission, says they still have an anti-Semitism problem. The question I have, especially for the most liberal on the panel, instead of attacking the Trump administration for what they're doing, and I disagree with what they're doing, there is due process, I would like to ask what the universities should be doing of their own to fix the problem. I mean, you may say all this is a sledgehammer and it's not about anti-Semitism. That's fine. But surely these universities have not done everything they can to combat anti-Semitism. And instead of being worried about the rights to free speech, Let's talk about the obligations that honest academicians have to the academy in telling the truth and avoiding Title VI violations. So I want to know what I want to know. Instead of attacking Trump, let's talk about what Harvard and Columbia and Penn and all the rest could be doing differently, because that's the source of this whole problem.
I'm wondering who's the most liberal person on the panel.
So I want one of you guys to speak up. What's your answer? Don't attack Stanley. Tell me what you would do.
Well, as I said, I'm hesitant to speak about other institutions where I don't have inside information about how they operate, even though I have visited at Harvard, I think at least 3 different semesters, and I teach regularly at Columbia, but I'm not a member of the governance of those institutions. I am at Yale. So the fundamental, I can tell you how actually universities at best need to operate. Here's the problem. No one knows very much. It's a Hayekian problem about information. These universities are extremely complex institutions, especially when you're trying to run a world-class hospital and medical school, which has a totally different business model. It's about patients and big science, and a liberal arts undergraduate education. Totally different things. It's so huge, just wrapping your head around it, and no one really has enough information to really understand the entirety of the beast. So we're going to talk about who's going to be the least bad. Government is actually bad. They don't have the right values and and they have their own incentives. Donald Trump comes from the Roy Cohn school of lawyering, and he was a mob lawyer. So it wouldn't be government, in my view. Our private universities have outperformed our public universities over 250 years. There were 9 universities at the time of the founding, 9 colleges. 7 of them remain among the top 14 in the country, and they're the 7 private. They're the 7 oldest Ivies. And Rutgers and William & Mary actually have slid down their public. We have great public universities, Michigan, Virginia, California, and elsewhere, but our private universities are amazing. So wouldn't be government. Okay, students don't know anything, and they know how to protest, but alums are well-intentioned. We're very grateful for all your support, but you guys can't teach classes and produce books, and so you can give us your support, but you can't really run the place. The administrators, actually, many of them don't have the right values. They're bureaucrats. They've never written a book or taught a class or created an idea. The people who, the staff and the people who live in New Haven, it's just a check for them. They don't have a commitment to these things. So who's left? Faute de mieux, just it's the least bad, it's the faculty. And I would say the most important faculty should be our most distinguished faculty. This is very self-serving on my part, but I'm a Sterling professor, damn it. I'm not just the most liberal person on the panel, okay? And Nicholas Christakis is a Sterling professor, and it's not easy to become a Sterling professor. There are people who actually got Nobel Prizes before they were made Sterling professors at Yale. So faute de mieux, I think the people who should be taking the lead in this are our greatest professors who have earned the right to actually show some leadership, and that's why I tip my hat to the great Nicholas Christakis or Kate Stiff or others. And what I've tried to do is, in my teaching, say this is important, American constitutional law, everyone should take this class. And we need intellectual diversity, so every year, for the last 14 years, I co-teach with the national co-chair and co-chairman of the Federalist Society. His name is Steve Calabrese. We need more intellectual diversity, so we need to bring in people like Keith Whittington on our faculty. Originalism shouldn't just be something, for a few people on the right. Everyone needs to learn about it, and so we actually have, I have organized it, a program coordinated with Steve Calabrese on learning originalism. So what we scholars need to do is, yes, step up and show actually what it's supposed to be. You, as alums, have to pressure the administrators into supporting us rather than other factions in the university, including on the faculty and definitely among students who actually don't have the right values. Okay, and that's what you can do. You can actually, and if you're interested in American history and American civics, then read the books that we produce, okay? And that gives us more clout in the outside world against the administrators who will bend with the wind.
You won't be surprised to hear that I have a contrary point of view. Professor Amar, I think, is an honorable exception to most faculty members. Like I said at the beginning, if we depend on the faculty, that's how we got into this trouble. We'll never get out of it with the faculty. I think it's going to take greater activity by trustees and the president, meaning the president of the university, and high administrators, to go in on searches and block all the points at which people who are not consistent with academic orthodoxy are filtered out, because they're filtered out, not just by diversity statements, but by 1,001 other things. The change will never come internally. There are some honorable exceptions, but they're a great minority.
I have a question. I've not heard the Supreme Court mentioned in all this. Where do they fit, and what's going to happen going forward?
8 of the 9 of them went to one of 2 schools. And that's because actually, and if you come to my talk at the Yale Law School at 11 o'clock, I'll show you other statistics about our great private institutions, which do disproportionately feed our political system. But the Supreme Court itself is filled with graduates of Harvard and Yale, since you're wearing your Yale. I think they have benefited from these great institutions, as have I. I'm a total Yaley all the way through. I'm pandering to the crowd here, you see, because you guys are Yaleys. The Supreme Court, in my view, did the right thing in the Students for Fair Admissions case. I'm someone who believed in a certain amount of affirmative action for a certain time, but a certain amount and for a certain period. And affirmative action, rightly understood, never meant discriminating against Asian Americans in favor of whites so that it was easier to get in as a white than Asian American, which is what Harvard was plainly doing. And so good for the Supreme Court for calling them out on that, even if one believes affirmative action, which is very, very dangerous stuff. I believe in arguably a certain kind of affirmative action in the name of intellectual diversity for reasons that Stanley identified. It's so natural to think, well, we want to hire smart people. I'm a smart person. So people who agree with me, they're the smart people, and the people who disagree with me, they're not the smart people. And it's nothing personal or something. I'm actually just being neutral and principled. I just want to find the smart people, and it just happens to be the case that they're people who agree with me. So I believe in my own head I have to do internal affirmative action to try to offset the natural cognitive bias that people have in favor of their own views. Well, that's affirmative action of a certain sort, and it might have been, I just gave you the argument for intellectual diversity, an old-fashioned argument for affirmative action of a different sort, or, white people may tend to replicate white people, and just institutions tend to self-replicate in all sorts of ways, but if you ask what the Supreme Court did that I very much agree with, and I disagree with lots of stuff, I have a free weekly podcast, you could listen to it, it's often all about the Supreme Court, is the students, on what we've been talking about, the Students for Fair Admissions is an important decision. And the Trump administration has grabbed that and read it very broadly, but I think fairly.
I've been given this and told to speak quickly, so I want to do 2 things quickly. One is that I think there's a certain blindness that I'm hearing from the panel and all over, and that is that when you have these institutions, as you said, which feed the Supreme Court, government, everything else, and 97% of the professors here, as I heard yesterday morning, are on the right, and 3%
On the left.
on the left, sorry, and 3% on the right, that you are not going to get anything other than a left government, a left everything else, because you control the process. And as smart as the people who control the universities are and who teach, there are some of us outside of the universities that are also smart, that think differently and would like our children to have an education which is balanced. And they're not getting it, and therefore something's got to be done. And the second is really a more open-ended question, but you referred with great horror to the action taken about student visas at Harvard. But I think there's some information that we don't know for sure. It was explained by I think the Attorney General, and I wish we had one who was more learned than the one that we have, but that Harvard was not following the rules, the requirements of the student visa program. They were not, as required, providing backgrounds of the students that they wanted to have student visas. They were not agreeing to provide the information about the criminal background, and that other universities are complying. So I think that it's fair to say that they should be required to comply, and if they're not, action should be taken against them.
On that last point, I wish I had said that. Oh, I did. I'm sorry, but I did.
Yeah, I mean, international students are obviously very much of an asset to a university. But if you read the Harvard anti-Semitism report, there's some pretty scary stuff in there about the way in which international students at the School of Public Health and the medical school set out to discourage Jewish students from enrolling, and in fact succeeded in driving them away. And just a couple days ago, we saw what globalize the Intifada actually means. So there are potential problems there. And yes, your point is exactly right. There was a problem last year when MIT openly said that it was not going to discipline students who had shut down the main administration building because it didn't want to jeopardize their visa status. And that's just wrong. And the Trump administration is right to try to get that information. On the other hand, you know, they've taken shortcuts on the process for completely pulling the authorization for visas. And like I say, I think they're going to lose in court in the short term because of that. But broadly speaking, I think that the administration, which has many very powerful levers to pull, is ultimately going to win a protracted conflict with higher education, and it would be very much in the interest of higher education to settle. And what Trump has really done is there's a whole political dimension to this. I mean, the administration clearly has a substantive interest in changing higher education, but there's a political dimension, and the Republican Party has been dramatically changed. I mean, there was the Reagan era with William Bennett and Lynn Cheney, and the first George Bush. But then during W. Bush, there was no interest whatsoever in doing anything about higher education. And now all of that has changed. Going forward, any serious national Republican is probably going to have major reform to higher education as a key part of his platform. And that is the huge change that I believe President Trump has made going forward. And it's a message to universities that you better take care of your own house or you're going to be in trouble, because you don't want one of the two major parties of this country thinking that you're illegitimate. And right now, you're illegitimate.
I'll be very quick on your first point. Universities, including Yale, need far more viewpoint diversity. I'm not opposed to some kind of affirmative action for those who have non-liberal perspectives for universities. And in the not for universities, but on social phenomena and so on. And in the meantime, I think universities can do things like encouraging strongly encouraging, considering viewpoint diversity in teaching and research, potentially even through review of departments, schools, and centers within a university.
Yeah, I'm struck because as a history teacher at the secondary level, I keep thinking about Einstein's contribution and the Ritchie boys' contribution of 60% of actionable intelligence as Jewish refugees to the United States, then from D-Day to the Eagle's Nest, and what kind of environment would they be even allowed in the country if we decide to pull all the student visas. So to your point about yes and approach, I was taught in the classics, in the canon, and then was also taught from Howard Zinn later on, and I think a yes and approach is the best approach. And to mandate a core and to say this isn't, that to me feels like censorship, so I'd love a response. And then I'm also struck by the idea of this anti-DEI approach. I'm curious, which is offensive? Diversity, equity, or inclusion? Which one do we want to get rid of, or we want to get rid of all three? And if we do, how are you going to change the 3% of conservatives if you're not going to include diversity, if you're not going to include equity of thought, if you're not going to include viewpoint? So I'm struck by the internal, call me naive, but the internal hypocrisy of an anti-DEI approach at the same time as calling for more voices. So that's my question. How do we cut both at the same time?
The questioner is very modest. His name is Aaron Hull. He's a wonderful public school teacher here in Connecticut. He's and a friend. And he actually is the faculty advisor for a spectacular program in the Greenwich High School, We the People team, where the kids learn a ton of American civics. They often win statewide and go on to national competition. And we thank you for your service, because actually public school teachers don't get very much thanks and support. So thank you, Aaron. The truth is, though, on DEI, and Aaron doesn't try to indoctrinate his students. I've known him for many years. But I think the criticism is there's not really much of a focus at all on intellectual diversity where there should be, and there tends to be way too much emphasis. I'm just telling you what the criticism is, of a certain kind of demographic diversity, which means quotification, which tends to actually see people not as individuals and as thinkers, but just as members of certain groups. So that's the critique. And truthfully, the way DEI in fact operates in lots of places that I have seen close up, and administrators who come to, this becomes their bailiwick, their fiefdom, and they have incentives to make their fiefdom bigger and bigger and bigger and turn everything into this rather than into ideas. There is, within the ecosystem of the university, real tension between administrators and idea people. That's the critique of DEI, and I think some of it is fair.
Well, and on your point about the curriculum, my brief presentation of what Harvard or Yale might do comes out of model legislation for public universities at the state level called the General Education Act. I'm a co-author of that model. And it doesn't just say that you should study to the West. The West is prioritized. But you should definitely study other cultures, and that's in there. I'm a social anthropologist by training. I'm all in favor of studying cultures outside the West, but you can't really do that unless you understand first who you are. And I would say a model here would be Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville's great book. The only way he was able to understand the distinct nature of America was because he had such profound insight into aristocracy. And really, the entire book is really a double comparison all along. And we tend to misread other cultures through a Western lens. So not only do we need to study the West just to appreciate and make our own system work, but even if we want to study other cultures, it's a prerequisite to study the West. I do think it deserves priority, but it doesn't deserve exclusive attention. And in the larger proposal, we definitely include studying other cultures.
I think some of the criticism of DEI also is deserved. I mean, I think there's a difference between capital DEI and lowercase diversity, equity, and inclusion. The capital DEI is how these things have been implemented in schools, including K through 12 schools. A lot of that has been very problematic, as has already been mentioned. I do think that there are more effective ways of achieving lowercase diversity. Let's stay away from equity right now. There's various definitions of what that is, but at least diversity and inclusion. We mentioned viewpoint diversity, but I think it's also to consider socioeconomic status. I think that's a more direct measure, a direct way of getting at the things we care about. Supporting those who are disadvantaged in real material ways, but are able to achieve at a high level. I don't have a problem with giving a student like that more weight. And if someone from a low income setting is able to perform just as well, or maybe even a little bit worse than someone who's had all the advantages in life, I don't think most people would have a problem with giving that student a little more consideration and a little more weight. So I think that's a far more effective way of getting at improving diversity, along with the diversity of viewpoint. And along those lines, you're a public school teacher. I think we should consider things like Roller Fryer had proposed. Universities, you really want to improve diversity of your student pool, will put your money where your mouth is and invest in creating schools in K through 12, create some lab schools, Yale University, and put them in the most disadvantaged communities and prove that you can bring all of your genius to preparing these students to perform at a high level, just as high a level as those who've had more resources. So I think that would be one example of Yale making a real commitment to improving diversity and inclusion.
Your alumni contributions
Yes.
go to the endowment, which provide much more generous scholarships than Yale has ever provided before, Pell Grants for folks who come from less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's a direct connection. Your philanthropy creates an endowment, thanks to the great David Swenson, which we've grown, at a phenomenal rate, which creates way more scholarships, need-based scholarships than Yale ever had before, Pell Grant especially, and that's why I don't want that confiscated socialistically by the government.
And with that, I think we have reached the end of our time here today. So if you could please join me in thanking our panelists.